Howdy folks, I'm Ben Starr. Welcome back to my messy kitchen. And I've received a number of requests for a short, simple video on how to care for your sourdough starter if you're using my Simple Sourdough method. Now, if you're new to my videos, Simple Sourdough is a revolutionary technique for super lazy people like me who want to make delicious, perfect artisan sourdough bread without all of that ridiculous folding and slapping every single hour and coddling your bread into existence. With this method, you don't ever have to worry about when the last time you fed your starter was. You don't have to feed your starter before you bake, and it only takes 5 minutes on day 1 and 10 minutes on day 2 to produce an exceptional loaf of bread. So, how do you take care of your starter? You basically don't. You ignore it in the refrigerator until it's time to bake. And when it's time to bake, you pull it out of the refrigerator. Now, if it's been a month, 2 months, 3 months, 5 months since you last fed your starter, you're going to see this layer of nasty, dark liquid on top of your starter. Some folks like to call that hooch. That is a mildly alcoholic and very acidic liquid that has risen to the top of the starter as your yeast have gone inactive and are dormant in the matrix of the starter below. They're chilling out. They're asleep, they're taking a nap, they're waiting for you to feed them. Under no circumstances do you pour this liquid away. I know it looks gross, and I know you wouldn't normally want to drink or incorporate anything like that into something you're baking, but you have to trust me, literally the worst thing that you can do for your starter is to discard that hooch. It belongs inside the starter, it is part of your starter, stir it back in before you get ready to bake. If you pour it off, not only are you losing some vital flavor-producing compounds, but you're also screwing up the hydration rate of your starter, and your recipe's not going to work. So don't pour it off. That is the only preparation that your starter needs before you're ready to bake a loaf of simple sourdough. So when is it time to feed the starter? Well, there's a very simple answer to that, and it's when you're about to run out. When you no longer have enough starter left in your container to bake another loaf, it's time to feed it. Feeding is simple. You at least double the weight of the starter with equal parts flour and water. I'm going to say that again. You at least double the weight of the starter with equal parts flour and water. So I've got my scale here, and I'm going to weigh my starter. This whole thing weighs 5.8 ounces. Now I know that these little plastic deli cups that I use each weigh an ounce. Now if you don't know how much your container weighs or don't really want to do math in your head, you can estimate. It's okay as long as you at least double it. So I'm just going to take the entire weight of this thing, 5.8, that's about 6. I need to feed this starter at least 6 more ounces of ingredients. I could also add 8 or 10 or 12 or 50 if I wanted to make a huge batch of starter, as long as you are at least doubling your starter. Today I'm going to feed 8 ounces of water and 8 ounces of flour to my starter. Now, with your water, ideally you want to use filtered water that does not have chlorine or chloramines in it. Their purpose is to kill bacteria and microorganisms. And what are yeast? They are fungal microorganisms. So the more you can coddle your yeast and provide them a happy environment, the better. And chlorine is not a happy environment. So 8 ounces of water. I went a little bit too far on that, so what I'm going to do is just scooch out a little bit. Or I could simply feed that same amount of flour. I went to 8.3, you could feed 8.3 ounces of flour, and that would be fine. All right, now I'm going to add my flour and then stir. See how that's nice and thick? Starter turns super liquidy after a long time of resting in the fridge. And that is because as the starter becomes more and more acidic from the lactobacillus bacteria breaking down the alcohol, the ethyl alcohol produced by the yeast as a byproduct of eating the starches, they turn that ethyl alcohol into acetic acid or vinegar or lactic acid. And as those acids attack the proteins in the flour, they snip those proteins or those gluten strands in half, and that makes the whole thing a lot looser and more liquidy. So it's okay for your starter to be nice and liquidy after it hasn't had a feeding in 3, 4, 5 months. But as soon as you have fed your starter, it should be nice and thick like this, not really of a pourable consistency at all. One other thing to be aware of is that your starter is going to rise or expand in volume as it sits. So you never want to fill your container more than about halfway full because it might come up and pop off the lid. Of course, if you make too much starter, you can always gift some to a neighbor or a friend, or take some out and use it in any type of sourdough discard recipe. Now the next step is very, very important. Cover your starter lightly. These plastic lids are not airtight, so they'll let any expanding gas out. But you want to leave it on the countertop for at least an hour, and this is especially important because your yeast were totally asleep in this starter. If there was hooch on the top of it, your yeast were in a deep, deep coma. You have just literally given them the biggest feast of their entire lives, but it's going to take them just a little bit of time to wake up, yawn, stretch out, and then really start attacking the starches in the flour that you've just fed them. If you put it back in the refrigerator immediately, those cold temperatures are going to keep the yeast warm and cozy inside their beds. So you definitely need to allow the starter time to warm up. You'll start noticing very specifically some air bubbles developing throughout the matrix of the starter, and as soon as you notice that there's a lot of air bubbles developing, at that point, the starter can go into the fridge. Now, I know you're going to ask me, why shouldn't I feed my starter before I bake bread? Won't that make the bread better? Not necessarily. With my simple sourdough method, your entire goal in life is to keep your yeast asleep in a deep coma until you actually make that loaf of bread. The conventional method for making sourdough is very similar to the method for making sourdough with commercial yeast. The goal is to get that loaf of bread from flour to loaf in as little time as possible. So those recipes want your starter to be robust, rip-raring to go. And the only way to do that is to keep feeding your starter very frequently so that your yeast never go to sleep. In my starters, after the yeast has chewed through all of the starches in the flour and they go to sleep and the hooch rises to the top, they stay in that dormant state until we wake them up. At that point, they start gorging on that starch. And the fatter and happier they get, they start getting a little bit rounder and they start reproducing, making more of themselves. When that activity reaches its peak frenzy, tons of carbon dioxide and tons of ethyl alcohol are being produced. And that is exactly when we want that loaf of bread to be rising and just at its peak to go into the oven. With a conventional sourdough method where you have got a starter that's at that point before you even add it to the bread, the yeast very rapidly chew through all the starch in that bread and it rises very quickly. That's why most sourdough recipes you can go from start to finish in a single day, unless the recipe intentionally slows down that process by putting it in the fridge. Now, why would they want to slow down the process but start with really, really robust, happy yeast? If you just start with sleepy yeast in the beginning, the whole process is slow from start to finish. And that's the entire purpose of my method. The longer it takes for those yeast to convert the starch in the bread into ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide, the more flavor we have. So why not just start off with sleepy yeast in the beginning? Because it's going to take them a long time to get to the place where they're replicating like crazy, and that rewards us with flavor. It also rewards us by being able to sit on the couch and watch TV or cook something else in our kitchen or work in the garden and take care of our chickens rather than having to take care of that bread, folding it all the time, then getting it into the fridge before it gets too heavily risen. Now, the miracle of bread is made possible because of a natural process that happens inside that seed. A grain of wheat is a seed. If you plant it, it will grow into a wheat plant. But all seeds on the planet work like this. They are bound up on the inside with a lot of very complex starch molecules that are equipped to handle a long, cold winter and still stay alive. And the germ, the tiny little baby plant, is dormant inside that seed. But when you get that seed wet, when it soaks in water, natural enzymes that are built into those complex starch carbohydrates begin to break those complex carbohydrates down into simple starches and simple sugars to provide food for that tiny little plant in its first few days of infancy until it can develop leaves big enough to produce energy from the sun and roots strong enough to take water and nutrients from the soil. So that seed has all of those perfect little packets of life-giving matter within it in order to allow it to come to life. Now, when we grind up that seed, the majority of what we have in flour are those complex carbohydrates, those starches that are bound up together, along with the natural enzymes that are ready to go to work the instant the seed gets wet, or the instant we pour water into the flour. As soon as that happens, those enzymes go to work breaking down those complex carbohydrates into simple starches and simple sugars, which are things that our yeast can actually eat. And if they eat them, they'll produce carbon dioxide, which is what causes the loaf to rise. And they'll also produce, as their waste process, ethyl alcohol, which the bacteria in our sourdough colony break down into various acids, which makes our bread a little bit tart and very flavorful. And this process, which was supposed to happen when the seed got wet to begin sprouting, actually happens in our dough as we're creating sourdough. And it's a really exquisite and fascinating process. But the longer we take for that process to happen, the more flavor is developed. That's why many years ago I thought, it's really stupid that I'm having to feed my starter every day or every couple of days to keep it in this hyperactive state, because I don't want the yeast in a hyperactive state. I want that flour and water to begin breaking down all of those starches into those flavorful subcomponents, which provide more food for my yeast. And at the same time, my sleepy yeast will slowly come to wake and slowly begin processing those starches and sugars. And it just seems way more rational to let the process take a longer time. Not only does it involve less effort on my part and less waste because I'm never discarding starter in order to feed it again, the whole process of sourdough never really made sense to me once I learned the science behind baking bread. That is where this method came from. So, forget about feeding your starter before you bake bread. In theory, the longer it has been since you fed your starter, the more delicious your final loaf will be because it will take a longer amount of time for the yeast to wake up and start feeding. I had a number of folks that had fed their starter an hour or two before they baked their bread, and the bread didn't really come out very well, and they asked me why, and the problem was that they fed their starter before they baked. So, let's dispense with this whole nonsense about feeding your starter on a regular interval. It's a waste of time, it's a waste of flour, and it's a waste of starter. Only feed your starter when you get low and need to make more, and you'll be in for many years of happy and easy sourdough baking for the rest of your life. I'm Ben Starr. Thanks again for watching. Please check out my website, benstarr.com, and subscribe to my YouTube channel for lots more interesting and fun, sciencey cooking facts. Have a great day.